$75,000. In my world of wealth management, it's a rounding error. In my mother's world, it was exactly 6 months of chemotherapy, 3 rounds of radiation, and a fighting chance to breathe. Now it was just a phantom line item on a glowing screen. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. As a Boston financial advisor, I am trained to view numbers devoid of emotion, but the digit staring back at me felt like a physical knife twisting in my gut. The Cancer Medical Trust, a fortress I helped build to keep the Reaper at bay, had been breached. There was no hack, no shadowy cyber thief. The hemorrhage was an inside job, bleeding out through a legally ironclad power of attorney. The authorized signatory? Vanessa, my own sister. I traced the digital breadcrumbs, my vision narrowing. First, a surgical extraction of $30,000. 2 weeks later, a brazen decapitation of $45,000. I called the Charleston Bank, desperate for a clerical error. Instead, a horribly cheerful teller confirmed the slaughter. "Fully authorized, Ms. Carter. Have a lovely day." Technically legal, morally bankrupt, Vanessa wasn't just stealing cash, she was embezzling our mother's remaining days on Earth. I hung up the phone, the silence in my office deafening. The rational, calculating part of my brain, the part that managed multi-million-dollar portfolios, demanded an audit of the motive. I didn't have to look far. The answer was waiting for me on Instagram, draped in silk and bathed in golden hour light. There was Vanessa, radiantly clutching a crystal champagne flute next to her fiancé, Daniel Rhodes. They were posing beneath a monstrously opulent floral arch at an exclusive Savannah estate. The caption made my blood run absolute zero. "Secured the dream venue, #Forever Rhodes." My eyes dropped to the timestamp. The first withdrawal funded the deposit. The second, larger bleed? Likely the caterers, the orchids, the bespoke string quartet. I sat in the dark, the glow of the monitor washing over me like a coroner's light. I had spent my entire life playing by the rules, building wealth safely, calculating risks, trusting the sanctity of family. Vanessa had weaponized that trust. She traded our mother's survival for a fleeting, picturesque vanity project. Most people would scream, confront her, and cause a messy, useless family drama. But I am an auditor. I don't throw tantrums, I dismantle infrastructures. Vanessa thought the power of attorney made her untouchable. She forgot who built the vault. She wanted a fairy tale wedding funded by blood money. Fine. I would give her a show Savannah would never forget, and a final bill she could never afford. I tried to convince myself there was still a reasonable explanation. Families trusted each other with money all the time, especially when illness forced decisions to happen quickly. My mother had signed the power of attorney herself. She had insisted Vanessa handle the account because she lived closer to Charleston and could deal with the hospital paperwork when necessary. The logic of that arrangement had made perfect sense at the time. Yet the more I replayed the numbers in my mind, the more difficult it became to ignore how strangely the timing lined up with Vanessa's wedding announcements. The next morning, I opened the banking portal again before leaving for work. The trust account balance stared back at me in quiet, unforgiving numbers. I clicked through the transaction history once more, slowly, carefully, the way I would examine an unfamiliar investment portfolio for a client. The withdrawals were not the only entries that caught my attention. Each one had been processed at the same Charleston branch within days of major updates Vanessa had posted online about her wedding planning. The venue reservation, the catering preview, the announcement that she and Daniel had chosen a luxury garden resort in Savannah for the ceremony. Every post seemed to appear right beside a matching bank transaction. I closed the laptop and tried to focus on my workday, but concentration came slowly. Managing investments required attention to detail, and the spreadsheets on my office monitor began to blur together as my thoughts drifted back to the trust account. Numbers rarely lied. When something unusual appeared in a financial pattern, experience had taught me to examine it from every angle before drawing conclusions. By mid-afternoon, I realized there was one step I had avoided taking. I needed to call my mother. Margaret Carter answered on the third ring, her voice warm and steady despite the faint fatigue I had grown used to hearing since her diagnosis. She asked about Boston, about the cold weather, about whether I was working too many hours again. The conversation drifted comfortably through familiar topics before I found a quiet moment to ask about her treatment schedule. She described the upcoming hospital visits and the medications the doctors had adjusted during her last appointment. Nothing in her tone suggested anything unusual about the financial arrangements supporting those treatments. Carefully, I asked whether the hospital had requested any large payments recently. She sounded surprised by the question. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "The trust fund has everything covered for now. Vanessa told me the account was stable and that we still had more than enough for the next round of treatment." Her words settled into my thoughts with uncomfortable weight. According to the bank statement I had reviewed that morning, nearly half of the trust had already disappeared. Yet my mother believed nothing had changed. After we finished the call, I sat quietly in my office, staring out the window at the gray Boston skyline. If the withdrawals were connected to medical costs, my mother would have known. Hospitals did not quietly accept tens of thousands of dollars without explanation. The more I replayed the conversation in my mind, the clearer the contradiction became. That evening, curiosity led me back to Vanessa's social media page again. Her wedding planner had posted a short video showing the couple walking through the Savannah Resort Gardens while discussing decoration ideas. The caption mentioned that the final venue deposit had just been secured. The clip was only 20 seconds long, but it was enough to make something shift inside my chest. I checked the date on the post. Then I opened the bank records again. The deposit mentioned in the video had been finalized on the exact same day as the second withdrawal from the trust account. For several minutes, I sat motionless at my desk, listening to the quiet hum of the office lights above me. The pattern that had begun as a suspicion now felt harder to dismiss. 2 large withdrawals, 2 major wedding expenses, both occurring within days of each other. Coincidences could happen once. Twice began to look like something else entirely. I closed the laptop slowly and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number of someone I rarely called outside of professional matters. Adrian Keller had been a financial compliance attorney for years, someone I had consulted occasionally when clients faced complicated legal questions about trusts or asset protection. My thumb hovered over his name for a moment before I pressed the call button. Because if the pattern I was seeing meant what I thought it did, then the wedding Vanessa was planning in Savannah might not be funded by her savings at all. It might be funded by money meant to keep our mother alive. Adrian Keller listened without interrupting while I explained what I had found. His office was quiet except for the soft clicking of a pen in his hand as I laid the printed bank statements across his desk. The numbers looked even heavier on paper than they had on my laptop screen. 2 withdrawals, each large enough to make anyone responsible for the account pause before approving them. Adrian studied the documents carefully, his expression calm and professional in the way lawyers develop after years of reading financial disputes that often begin as family disagreements. When he finally looked up, his voice remained neutral. "Technically, the power of attorney allows Vanessa to withdraw funds if she believes it benefits your mother's care." He tapped the paper lightly with his pen. "But that authority still carries responsibility. The money is supposed to be used for your mother's needs, not personal expenses." I nodded slowly. "That's exactly what worries me." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "At this stage, we're not accusing anyone of anything. All we have is a pattern that raises questions. The next step is verifying whether those withdrawals can be connected to medical costs or something else." The words "something else" lingered in the room. Adrian turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen as he opened a document request form. "First, we confirm the transactions directly with the bank. Then we examine the authorization document your mother signed. After that, we look for where the money went." His tone remained steady, almost clinical. Financial trails usually tell their own story. The following week moved slowly. Adrian submitted formal inquiries to the Charleston Bank, requesting confirmation of the withdrawals and copies of the documentation used to authorize them. While we waited for a response, I tried to continue my normal routine in Boston. I met with clients, reviewed portfolios, and sat through long conference calls about market projections. Yet every quiet moment brought my thoughts back to the trust account and the unanswered question hovering over those missing funds. 3 days later, Adrian called. "The bank confirmed the transactions," he said. "Both withdrawals were made in person at the Charleston branch. Vanessa presented the power of attorney document and identification. Everything appeared routine from their perspective." I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. Did they say where the money went? "That part takes more time," Adrian replied. "Cashier withdrawals are harder to trace unless we can connect them to another payment." That evening, curiosity pulled me back to Vanessa's social media again. Her wedding planner had posted a new set of photographs showing a catering tasting event at the Savannah Resort. Vanessa stood beside Daniel at a long table covered with sample dishes and wine glasses, while staff members adjusted floral arrangements in the background. The caption mentioned that the couple had finalized the catering contract that afternoon. I checked the date. Then I opened the bank records again. The catering announcement appeared 2 days after the first $30,000 withdrawal. My stomach tightened as the pattern grew clearer. The next morning, I forwarded the screenshot of the post to Adrian with a short message explaining the timing. Within an hour, he replied asking me to come by his office that afternoon. When I arrived, he already had several documents spread across the desk. One of them was a scanned copy of the power of attorney form my mother had signed the previous year. I had seen the document before, but looking at it now felt different. Adrian pointed to the signature line at the bottom. "Your mother signed this during treatment last winter?" he asked. "Yes," I said quietly. "She wanted someone nearby to handle the financial paperwork." He nodded thoughtfully. "The document itself is valid, but if someone used it to move funds for reasons unrelated to her care, that could create a serious legal problem." My eyes drifted back to the bank statements beside the form. The numbers seemed to stand there silently, waiting for the rest of the story to appear. Adrian slid another paper toward me. "I've requested security footage from the Charleston branch on the days those withdrawals were made. If Vanessa handled the transactions personally, the cameras should confirm it." I exhaled slowly, realizing the investigation had already begun moving beyond suspicion. "Financial questions inside families can become complicated," Adrian continued, "but records rarely hide the truth for long." I looked down again at the timeline forming across the desk. The wedding venue reservation, the catering contract, the withdrawals from the medical trust. For the first time since I noticed the missing money, the pieces of the story were beginning to arrange themselves in a way that felt impossible to ignore. And if the next set of records confirmed what the pattern already suggested, then the celebration Vanessa was planning in Savannah might be standing on money that was never meant for a wedding at all. The email from Adrian arrived late in the afternoon while I was finishing a client report. The subject line was simple: "Security footage received." For a moment, I just stared at it on my screen, aware that whatever waited inside that message would move the situation beyond suspicion and into something harder to ignore. I opened the email slowly. Adrian had attached a secure viewing link and a short note asking me to come by his office that evening if possible. By the time I arrived, the sun had already disappeared behind the buildings outside his office window. Adrian had the footage ready on his computer. He motioned for me to sit down before pressing play. The video showed the interior of the Charleston Bank branch, recorded from a camera mounted high near the ceiling. The picture was grainy but clear enough to follow the movement inside the room. A teller stood behind the counter helping a customer while another employee sorted paperwork at a nearby desk. Then the door opened and Vanessa walked in. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Vanessa looked exactly the way she always did in public settings, confident, composed, dressed neatly in a pale jacket that made her stand out against the darker interior of the bank. She approached the counter with the easy posture of someone handling an ordinary errand. The teller greeted her with a polite smile and accepted the documents she placed on the counter. Adrian paused the video. "That's the first withdrawal date," he said quietly. I nodded without answering. He resumed the footage. Vanessa spoke briefly with the teller, pointing to the paperwork before signing a receipt. A moment later, the teller disappeared behind a side door and returned carrying a sealed envelope. Vanessa placed the envelope into her bag, thanked the employee, and walked out of the bank. The entire interaction lasted less than 4 minutes. Adrian switched to the second clip recorded 2 weeks later. The scene unfolded almost the same way. Vanessa entered the branch, presented the same documents, signed another receipt, and left with a second envelope. Watching the repetition felt strangely unsettling, as if I were observing a carefully rehearsed routine. When the video ended, the office felt very quiet. "That confirms physical presence," Adrian said, leaning back slightly in his chair. She conducted both transactions personally using the power of attorney. I kept my eyes on the paused screen where Vanessa's image stood frozen mid-step near the bank door. The footage didn't show panic or hesitation. It showed confidence. "What happens now?" I asked. Adrian reached for another document on his desk. "Now we follow the money." Over the next few days, he began examining records connected to the Charleston withdrawals. Cash transactions left fewer direct trails than electronic transfers, but large payments eventually passed through financial systems somewhere. Vendors, contracts, deposits. Every major expense created paperwork. While Adrian worked on the financial side of the investigation, I started noticing more details in Vanessa's public updates about the wedding. Her social media page filled with photographs of floral arrangements, menu tastings, and visits to the Savannah resort where the ceremony would take place. Each post celebrated another step toward what she described as the perfect wedding weekend. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table scrolling through those photos while the bank statements lay open beside my laptop. Something about the timeline began to feel impossible to ignore. The first withdrawal from the trust account had occurred only days before Vanessa posted about securing the Savannah venue. The second appeared shortly before the announcement of the catering contract. Numbers rarely align themselves so neatly without a reason. The next morning, Adrian called. "I've confirmed something interesting," he said. "One of the wedding vendors received a bank transfer matching the amount of the second withdrawal." My grip tightened slightly on the phone. "From Vanessa's account?" "That's the part we're still verifying," he replied, "but the timing suggests the funds moved quickly after the withdrawal." I sat quietly, letting the information settle. So the money might have gone directly to the wedding. "That's a possibility," Adrian said carefully. "We still need confirmation before drawing conclusions." Later that week, I traveled to Charleston to visit my mother. Margaret Carter sat comfortably in the living room when I arrived, sunlight spilling across the carpet from the large window beside her chair. She smiled when she saw me and immediately began talking about a new medication the doctors had added to her treatment schedule. Nothing about her demeanor suggested that half of her medical trust might already be gone. During our conversation, she mentioned Vanessa's wedding again, describing how excited she was to attend if her health allowed the trip to Savannah. She spoke about the venue as if it were something magical, repeating the details Vanessa had told her about the gardens and the lights that would fill the reception area. I listened quietly, feeling the weight of what I now knew pressing against every word. That night, I returned to Boston and opened the investigation folder Adrian had shared with me. The bank statements, the security footage, and the vendor records now formed a growing chain of evidence. Piece by piece, the financial trail was becoming clearer, and with every new document added to the file, the wedding Vanessa was planning in Savannah looked less like a celebration and more like the final destination of money that had once been meant for something else entirely. The investigation began to feel heavier once the first pieces of confirmation arrived. Up until that point, everything had existed as suspicion, patterns, and quiet questions. But when Adrian forwarded the preliminary report from the handwriting specialist, the situation moved into something far more serious. The expert had examined the signature on the power of attorney document and compared it with several older signatures from my mother's medical files. The conclusion was careful but unmistakable. The signature on the authorization form had been written under conditions that suggested physical weakness or possible guidance by another hand. I sat at my kitchen table reading the report 3 times before closing the document. My mother had signed that form during a difficult stage of treatment when fatigue and medication blurred the edges of her awareness. At the time, Vanessa had insisted the paperwork was necessary to make hospital payments easier. None of us had questioned it. Seeing the handwriting analysis now forced a new thought into my mind, one that I had avoided until that moment. What if Vanessa had not only used the power of attorney? What if she had controlled the circumstances under which it was signed? Later that afternoon, Adrian called to discuss the report. His voice remained steady, the way lawyers speak when they are explaining a situation that could eventually become complicated. "The handwriting review doesn't prove fraud," he said carefully, "but it raises concerns about the conditions under which the document was signed." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Meaning it could have been influenced?" "Yes," he replied. "And if someone used that authority to redirect medical funds for personal expenses, the legal implications could become significant." The words "personal expenses" hung in the air between us. After we ended the call, I opened Vanessa's social media page again, something that had become almost automatic over the past few weeks. A new set of photographs had appeared from a luxury bridal boutique in Savannah. Vanessa stood in front of a mirror wearing a flowing designer dress while a stylist adjusted the fabric along the shoulders. The captions celebrated finding the perfect gown. I glanced at the date, then I checked the transaction history in the trust account once more. 3 days earlier, another large payment had moved through the account. Not a withdrawal this time, a transfer. The number matched the estimated cost of the designer dress almost exactly. My pulse slowed into the quiet rhythm I recognized whenever I studied financial discrepancies at work. Numbers rarely told their stories loudly. They whispered patterns that only became visible when someone took the time to line them up correctly. The next morning, Adrian sent me a spreadsheet his office had created while reviewing wedding-related expenses connected to the Savannah resort. The list included vendor deposits, decoration contracts, catering arrangements, and the estimated value of the venue reservation. When I compared those numbers to the bank activity from the trust account, the alignment was impossible to ignore. Each major payment tied to the wedding appeared within days of money leaving the medical trust. I stared at the timeline until the pattern felt undeniable. Later that week, Adrian called again with another development. "One of the wedding vendors confirmed receiving a transfer directly from the trust account," he said. The words settled heavily in my chest. "So it's not just coincidence anymore?" "No," Adrian answered quietly. "Now we're looking at a financial trail." That evening, I visited my mother again in Charleston. She was sitting near the window with a blanket draped across her lap, reading a magazine while the afternoon sunlight filled the room. When she saw me, she smiled and began talking about the wedding invitations Vanessa had shown her earlier that week. "She's so excited," my mother said softly. "It's going to be beautiful." I nodded and listened while she described the garden venue and the elegant decorations Vanessa had promised would make the ceremony unforgettable. Her voice carried the quiet happiness of someone who believed her family was celebrating a joyful moment together. I didn't tell her about the investigation. Instead, I asked how she was feeling after her latest treatment. She spoke about the doctors, the medications, and the hope that the next round of therapy would continue slowing the illness. While she talked, I watched the gentle movement of her hands as she folded the corner of the magazine page. Those hands had signed the document giving Vanessa control of the trust account. Later that night, I returned to Boston and opened Adrian's investigation folder again. The files inside had grown steadily over the past weeks: bank confirmations, vendor invoices, the handwriting analysis report. Each document added another layer to the quiet story unfolding behind the wedding plans. Outside my apartment window, the city lights flickered across the river while traffic moved slowly along the bridge below. I sat at the desk reviewing the timeline once more. By now, the numbers were no longer just suspicious. They were beginning to look like evidence. And if the pattern continued the way it already had, the wedding Vanessa was preparing in Savannah might soon become more than a celebration. It might become the moment when the truth about where that money came from finally surfaced. Savannah greeted me with warm coastal air and the slow rhythm of a city that had learned how to make elegance look effortless. The taxi rolled past streets lined with tall oak trees draped in Spanish moss, while historic buildings glowed softly in the late afternoon light. I watched the scenery through the window, trying to steady my thoughts before arriving at the resort where Vanessa's wedding weekend had already begun. The venue stood near the edge of the historic district, a sprawling garden property surrounded by white fences and carefully trimmed hedges. Staff members moved quietly through the entrance area, carrying flower arrangements and equipment, while guests checked into the lobby with small suitcases and champagne glasses already waiting in their hands. Everything about the place projected luxury and celebration. To anyone else arriving that afternoon, the atmosphere would have felt magical. To me, it felt like walking into a carefully staged illusion. Inside the lobby, I recognized several decorations from the invoices Adrian had shown me earlier that week. Tall floral installations framed the reception desk, identical to the arrangements listed in the event planner's contract. The same company name appeared in both places. Seeing the physical version of something that had previously existed only on financial documents made the connection disturbingly real. A woman from the wedding staff handed me a welcome envelope containing the weekend schedule. Rehearsal dinner that evening, ceremony in the garden the following afternoon, reception under the lights beside the river. Every event described in the program had already appeared somewhere in Adrian's investigation file. I took the elevator to my room and set my bag on the bed before walking out onto the small balcony overlooking the gardens. Workers were adjusting rows of white chairs near the ceremony arch, while a team of planners discussed lighting arrangements near the stage where musicians would perform during the reception. The entire scene looked flawless. I checked my phone and saw a message from Adrian. The financial trail is now complete. Vendor confirmations match the trust withdrawals. I read the sentence twice before placing the phone in my pocket. Down in the garden, guests were beginning to gather for the welcome reception. Laughter drifted upward along with the faint sound of glasses clinking together. From a distance, it looked exactly like the kind of celebration Vanessa had always imagined for herself. Later that evening, I joined the reception crowd on the lawn. Vanessa spotted me almost immediately and walked over with a bright smile that looked exactly like the ones in her social media posts. She wrapped her arms around me in a quick hug before stepping back to study my face. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "Isn't this place incredible?" "It's beautiful," I answered. Daniel Rhodes joined us a moment later, tall and confident in a tailored jacket that matched the polished atmosphere of the event. He shook my hand warmly and thanked me for making the trip. "We've been planning this for months," he said proudly. "Vanessa deserves something unforgettable." Vanessa laughed and gestured toward the garden lights beginning to glow above the tables. "Just wait until tomorrow night. The reception is going to be spectacular." I nodded politely while my eyes drifted toward the long row of catering stations set up along the edge of the lawn. The company logo printed on the serving tables matched the vendor invoice Adrian had traced back to the trust account payment. The food being served to the guests tonight had likely been paid for with the same money meant for my mother's treatment. As the evening continued, I moved through the reception area quietly, observing details the way I might review financial records. The florist adjusting centerpieces, the lighting technicians installing equipment near the dance floor, the event planner checking off items on a clipboard. Every vendor present appeared somewhere on Adrian's spreadsheet. Near the bar, I overheard two members of the planning team discussing the final payment that had secured the event only days earlier. One of them joked that weddings at this scale always came down to the last-minute deposit. The date they mentioned matched the final withdrawal from the trust account. I stepped away from the conversation and walked toward the edge of the garden where the river reflected the glow of the reception lights. From there, the entire celebration spread out in front of me like a carefully designed performance. Music played softly while guests laughed and raised glasses in celebration. Vanessa moved through the crowd, greeting people with effortless confidence, never once showing the slightest sign that anything about this weekend might be built on something fragile. For everyone else attending the reception, the night marked the beginning of a beautiful wedding celebration. But standing there beside the river, watching the lights shimmer across the water, I knew something none of them did. Every payment connected to this event had already been documented. Every withdrawal from the trust account had been traced, and somewhere beyond the music and the laughter, the quiet truth behind this wedding was already waiting to surface. Morning light spread across the Savannah garden long before the first guests arrived. I walked slowly along the stone path beside the rows of white chairs, listening to the quiet movements of the staff preparing for the ceremony. Florists adjusted the final arrangements along the arch, while technicians tested the speakers near the aisle. The entire space looked as perfect as the photographs Vanessa had been posting for weeks. From a distance, the garden felt peaceful. Up close, it felt fragile. I found a seat near the back row and watched the planners move through their checklists. Each detail being finalized around me had once appeared as a number on the financial timeline Adrian and I had built together. The chairs, the flowers, the musicians rehearsing softly near the stage. Every element of the celebration had a cost, and every cost had left a trace somewhere in the trust account records. My phone vibrated in my hand. A message from Adrian appeared on the screen. All documentation verified. The financial trail is complete. I read the sentence once and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Whatever happened today would not change the facts already recorded in bank statements and vendor confirmations. Guests began arriving shortly after noon. Men in tailored suits and women in pastel dresses filled the garden with quiet conversations while servers offered glasses of champagne from silver trays. Several of Daniel's colleagues from the real estate firm gathered near the front rows, discussing business projects while waiting for the ceremony to begin. One of them laughed as he looked around the venue. "This wedding must have cost a fortune." Another nodded in agreement. Daniel always does things on a grand scale. Their voices carried easily across the garden, blending with the music drifting from the speakers. A few minutes later, the ceremony music changed, signaling that the bridal party was about to appear. Conversations faded into silence as everyone turned toward the entrance path. The first bridesmaids stepped into view, wearing pale dresses that moved gently in the warm breeze. Then Vanessa appeared. She walked slowly down the aisle beneath the sunlight, her white gown catching the light with every step. From where I sat, she looked radiant, confident, completely at ease with the hundreds of eyes watching her. Daniel stood waiting near the arch with a proud smile that never left his face. For the guests surrounding me, the moment represented the beginning of something beautiful. For me, it represented the final piece of a pattern that had already been written in financial records. The ceremony passed in a blur of soft music and carefully chosen words. When Vanessa and Daniel exchanged their vows, the crowd responded with warm applause. Cameras flashed while the couple shared their first kiss beneath the arch of flowers, a celebration built on perfect appearances. Afterward, the guests moved toward the reception lawn beside the river where tables glittered with candles and glass centerpieces. Servers carried trays of food through the crowd, while musicians played near the dance floor. I stood near the edge of the lawn, watching the celebration unfold. Vanessa moved easily through the guests, greeting relatives and business partners with effortless charm. Every smile she offered looked sincere. Every laugh sounded genuine. If she felt even the smallest hint of concern about the truth behind the event, she showed none of it. Daniel's colleagues gathered near the bar discussing future projects and investment opportunities. I recognized several of them from the conversation I had overheard the night before about the firm's strict compliance policies. Reputation mattered in their world. Financial transparency mattered even more. Vanessa approached me again while greeting guests near the center of the reception. "Can you believe this?" she said, gesturing toward the lights and music surrounding us. "It turned out exactly the way I imagined." "It's an incredible event," I replied calmly. Her smile widened with satisfaction. For a moment, she looked completely certain that everything around her would remain exactly the same. Later that evening, the reception music grew louder as guests filled the dance floor. Laughter and conversation blended into a bright wave of celebration that carried across the lawn and toward the dark river beyond the garden. I stepped away from the crowd and walked toward the balcony overlooking the water. From that distance, the wedding looked almost surreal. Lights shimmered across the garden while the sound of music drifted upward through the warm night air. Somewhere behind those lights existed a quiet file of documents and financial records that told another version of the story entirely. Bank withdrawals, vendor payments, authorization signatures, truth written in numbers. The celebration continued below me while the music echoed across the river. But the real story of this wedding had already been recorded long before the first guest arrived. And sooner or later, the truth hidden inside those records would reach the people responsible for asking where the money had come from. 3 weeks after the wedding in Savannah, the photographs were still everywhere online. Friends and relatives continued sharing images of Vanessa and Daniel beneath the glowing garden lights, raising glasses during the reception while music played beside the river. To anyone scrolling through those pictures, the weekend looked like the beginning of a perfect marriage. No one outside a very small circle knew that another story had already begun unfolding quietly behind the scenes. I was sitting in my Boston apartment early one morning when Adrian's name appeared on my phone again. His voice sounded calm, but there was a different tone beneath it, the kind that appears when a long process finally reaches its turning point. "The bank completed its internal review," he said. "They confirmed that the withdrawals from the trust account were used for payments connected to the wedding vendors." I closed my eyes for a moment and let the words settle. "So the financial trail is official now?" "Yes," Adrian replied. "The documentation is clear. The funds moved directly from your mother's medical trust to the event payments." Outside my window, the city was just beginning to wake up. Cars moved slowly across the bridge while the morning sun reflected off the river below. Everything looked ordinary, almost peaceful, but inside the quiet apartment, the meaning of Adrian's call changed the shape of everything that had happened over the past weeks. "What happens next?" I asked. "The bank has forwarded the case to its financial compliance division," he explained. "Because the withdrawals involved a trust intended for medical treatment, they're reviewing it as potential misuse of fiduciary authority." His words were careful, precise, the language of institutions that dealt with financial responsibility every day. "Daniel's company has also been notified that questions about the wedding payments are under review," Adrian continued. "Since several of their executives attended the event, the firm's compliance department is examining whether any undisclosed financial risk exists." I leaned back in my chair slowly. The truth had finally begun moving beyond our private investigation. Later that week, I traveled to Charleston again to visit my mother. Margaret Carter was sitting near the same window where I had seen her before, sunlight warming the room while a soft breeze moved the curtains gently beside her chair. She smiled when I walked in. "How was Savannah?" she asked. "It was beautiful," I said. She nodded with quiet satisfaction. Vanessa had told her stories about the ceremony, the music, the decorations glowing across the garden. My mother listened to those memories as if they were proof that everything in the family remained strong and joyful. For the moment, I let her keep that belief. Instead, we talked about her treatment, about the doctors adjusting her medications, about the small improvements she had begun to feel in recent weeks. I also told her that Adrian had helped place the medical trust under additional monitoring to ensure every future expense connected to her care would be protected carefully. She seemed relieved to hear that. "You always were the cautious one," she said gently. When I left the house later that afternoon, the sky above Charleston had turned the deep blue color that appears just before sunset. I walked slowly toward my car, thinking about the path the story had taken from that first suspicious bank statement to everything that had followed. Vanessa had believed the power of attorney document would protect her choices. She had believed the trust account was invisible behind family silence. But numbers have a way of revealing the truth when someone takes the time to follow them carefully. Back in Boston that night, I opened the investigation folder on my laptop one last time. The documents inside formed a quiet record of the entire story: bank withdrawals, vendor confirmations, security footage, handwriting analysis, facts written in numbers and signatures. Somewhere beyond my apartment window, life continued the way it always did. People celebrated weddings, trusted their families, believed that the systems protecting them would work when they needed them most. Sometimes they did, and sometimes it took patience and courage for the truth to appear. I closed the laptop and looked out across the city lights reflecting on the river. Stories like this are never really just about money. They're about trust, responsibility, and the quiet strength it takes to protect the people who depend on us. If this story made you think about the meaning of fairness inside a family, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you discovered something like this? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden truths behind complicated family situations, stay with the channel and consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and the next one might be closer to real life than any of us expect. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.